As I look out across the timeless hills and inlets of the Orkney Islands, it isn't hard to imagine a Viking longboat ominously making its steady progress towards the shore. Ancient history here is close enough to touch. I'm in Orkney to see how far the genes of Norse Vikings live on in the people who live here today. Oxford geneticist Sir Walter Bodmer is testing the DNA of the locals to solve a historical puzzle. Did the Vikings who invaded these islands more than 1,000 years ago bring their own women? Or did they take by force the wives and daughters of the local Picts? And if they did, what then happened to the Pictish men? It will take several weeks for the DNA results to come through, so in the meantime, I want to look at some historical clues. One of the DNA volunteers, Jean Flett, believes she's descended from a legendary Viking, Thorkel Flett. He's mentioned in the Orkney Inga Saga, a medieval text chronicling Norse rule on Orkney. Local historian Sarah Jane Gibbon picks up the story.
What it says is, you can see here, Thorkel Flettier het Bundi I Vestri, Odel o Mikkelhefer.
And that means?
It means that Thorkel Flettier was a farmer in Westry, and that he was quarrelsome and overbearing.
And so to be mentioned by name, does that mean that Thorkel Flett was somebody who mattered?
Because his name is mentioned, we know he's quite important. And he's mentioned at the very end of his life because he was actually burned in his house. So he had a rather violent end.
The Orkney Inga Saga says much about the Viking dynasties who once ruled Orkney. But what befell the Picts, the Celtic farmers who were the original inhabitants of these islands?
The Orkney Inga Saga doesn't mention anything about the people who were there before the Vikings.
Do you think it was some kind of year zero? I mean, did the Vikings come in and sweep everything away?
The fact that there's no pre-Norse place names in Orkney and the fact that the culture is so unbelievably Scandinavian would suggest that any population that were here must have been overcome or chased out or killed.
The Scottish Picts were one of the Celtic tribes descended from the hunter-gatherers who first settled Britain 10,000 years ago, when we were still connected to Europe by land. Legend describes the Picts as short, even pygmy-like. They were small, but they were brutes according to the Romans, who had to build an immense wall to keep the little blighters out. So when the strapping great Vikings arrived, did they settle down alongside the runty Picts? Or did they slaughter them? While Sir Walter's team analyses the DNA, I'm off in search of some less high-tech archaeological evidence. Here at the Broch of Bursay, we find the ruins of a Pictish settlement which fell into Viking hands. Archaeologist Julie Gibson is trying to work out what happened here. It looks as though they saw themselves as being fairly warlike.
Yes.
I mean, they're armed and carrying
certainly.
shields.
There's a Norse legend passed right the way down through to the 19th century people here of the Vikings first arriving in the island of Rousey and seeing the Picts like elves on the shore with shining spears and being too frightened to land the first time and going away again.
Once the Vikings came, almost all traces of the Pictish way of life seemed to vanish. How do you know that this is a Viking rather than a Pictish house?
Well, Pictish houses are round, basically, made up of many small round rooms.
Right.
And this is like the houses that they came from in Norway.
So you find these back home?
Yeah, that's right.
Is there evidence of the Vikings coming in and coexisting, living cheek by jowl with those who were already here?
The Pictish way of life was finished with once the Vikings came in.
Right.
Now,
how do you know that?
Because the houses don't continue to be lived in as houses, though some of the round houses are used as other things, as outhouses or whatever.
Right. What about the women? Is there evidence that the Vikings brought their own girls from home, or did they just come as shiploads of men and marry locals?
No, they definitely have Norse women with them. We have straight Viking women's graves.
What does all your study and even your gut instinct tell you in terms of whether it was an assimilation and peaceful, or whether it was violent and more of a takeover?
It took them maybe a few decades, but I think the Picts left or were pretty well exterminated. That's what I think.
So Julie Gibson believes the Vikings brought their own women and the Picts were annihilated. But other experts aren't so sure. Some argue that while the Pictish men may well have been slaughtered, the Vikings spared their women and took them as wives. If they did, this will show up in genetic differences between today's Orcadian men and women. Here's how. We all inherit 23 chromosomes from each parent, which form our genetic blueprint. The last pair determines our gender. 2 X chromosomes if you're a girl, an X and Y if you're a boy. And the key to solving the mystery lies in the male Y chromosome. This tiny slice of DNA, a small thing compared to the rest of the chromosomes in the human genome, is only passed down the male line. I have my dad's Y chromosome, just as he inherited his from his father, and so on back into my family's past. This legacy is the biological equivalent of a family heirloom, a watch or a ring, always passed down the male line. This means that Sir Walter can distinguish male and female ancestry by looking at different bits of DNA. And in the case of the men and women living in Orkney today, can compare their genetic profile with that of the Vikings' closest living relatives, the Norwegians. While the team wrestle with their pipettes, I want to look at another compelling bit of evidence, which is the physical appearance of the islanders. The way we look, of course, is determined by genes handed down to us by our distant ancestors. The more geographically remote and stable a community, the clearer the signal. And the Orkney Islands are about as remote and stable as you can get. So let's look at some vital statistics. Around a third of people in Norway have blonde hair. Here in Orkney, around 1 in 5 people are blonde. That's twice as many as on the Scottish mainland. Likewise with blue eyes, which are a common Viking feature. 40% of people living here have blue eyes, compared with just 10% in northern Britain. So much for the hair and eyes. How about the physique? I'm off in search of a genuine ancient Norse Viking to see how strapping they really were. About 40 years ago, on this beach in Orkney, archaeologists excavated a Norse Age cemetery. It's eerie. It's a little bit sad as well. But even today, skeletons are still eroding out of the cliff face. What we're looking at here is part of the spinal column. That's vertebrae all in a row, still in their original positions. This is a rib curling round here. And down at this point is part of the pelvis. So there's a whole body, a whole skeleton, gradually being eaten out of here by the sea. One of the most amazing discoveries to come out of that excavation was the skeleton of a Norse boatman. And it still has a huge amount of information to tell us. Professor Taya Mollison from the Natural History Museum has analysed the bones of this fellow, who died around 800 years ago.
If you just look at sort of little details, for example, this is the breastbone. If you look at most of them, they're fairly parallel-sided. Whereas this one, it's expanded, and there's a muscle that attaches here that goes across the chest, which is really developed. In this case, I think he's using oars and going to sea as a fisherman.
So that already speaks of a hard life lived.
From a very early age, yes, pretty strenuous.
Wear and damage to these bones describe a life of harsh, grinding toil for this chap, and we can assume his fellow Nordic settlers. But, bad teeth aside, I wonder whether he would look out of place in a Kirkwall supermarket today. If this individual was stood before us now, what would he have looked like?
Possibly like you, only a bit older. Possibly even about the same height.
Right, so about 5'10".